The morning Jennie Alden walked into Hector Prute's blacksmith shop with her hat in her hands and her pride quietly bleeding. She had already rehearsed the conversation 100 times on the 2-mile walk from her farm into the town of Callow Creek, Kansas, and every version of it had ended the same, with her asking for something she could not afford and being turned away. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas plains were waking up with that particular golden stubbornness that made even the hardest circumstances feel almost bearable. The wildflowers pushing up through the red clay along the roadside, the meadowlarks singing from the fence posts as though they had not a single trouble in the world. Jennie noticed none of it. Her mind was entirely occupied with the broken plow sitting in her barn, the 12 acres of unturned soil that needed to be in the ground by the end of the month, and the $340 of debt that had followed her husband Thomas into his grave 8 months prior. She was 28 years old. Her hands were already the hands of a woman who had worked without ceasing, rough at the knuckles and sun-browned to the wrist, and her dark hair, which had once been something she tended to carefully, was pinned back with a practicality that left no room for vanity. She had a daughter named Clara, 7 years old, who was at that very moment sitting with old Mrs. Henshaw 2 doors down from the blacksmith shop, learning her letters from a primer that Jennie had ordered through the mail and paid for by selling the last of Thomas's good shirts. Hector Prute was a round, decent man with a red beard and small eyes that missed very little. He looked at Jennie when she came through the door and set down his hammer with the unhurried patience of someone who had already read the situation before she opened her mouth. "Mrs. Alden," he said. "What can I do for you?" she told him. The right share of the plow had cracked along the weld seam after hitting a buried stone, and the left coulter was bent so badly that the whole assembly tracked sideways when she tried to use it, pulling the furrows crooked and tearing up more ground than it turned. She explained it in precise terms, the way Thomas had taught her to speak to tradespeople, clearly and without apology, and she watched Hector's face as he nodded slowly. "That's a full afternoon's work," he said, "maybe more. I need to reforge the share and straighten the coulter with heat. Parts alone will run me $1.50. "How much altogether?" she asked. He looked at her, not unkindly. $4. The number sat between them in the warm, smoke-smelling air of the shop. $4. Jennie had 62 cents in the tin box under the floorboard in her bedroom, and her next egg money wouldn't come until Friday when she took her dozen to the general store. She had been hoping he would say two. She would have found a way to manage two. "I see," she said. "I could extend some credit," Hector began, and she could hear the reluctance in it, the way a man sounds when he is offering something he cannot really afford to offer. "You've already extended credit to half the county," Jennie said, and she said it gently, without accusation, because it was the truth and they both knew it. "I wouldn't feel right asking you to stretch it further." "When could you pay?" he asked. "After harvest, if the season holds." "That's 6 months, Mrs. Alden. I know what it is." He was quiet for a moment. Behind him the forge breathed orange and red, and somewhere in the depths of the shop his young apprentice, a boy named Bobby, was filing something with a rhythmic persistence. Jennie stood straight. She would not cry. She had decided that weeks ago that crying was something she would do in private at night, where it would not be seen and could not be used to define her. "Let me see what I can do," Hector said finally. "Come back tomorrow morning." She thanked him and walked out into the bright Kansas morning, and she had not yet reached Mrs. Henshaw's door when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her, and turned without knowing why, as though some instinct had alerted her to something worth looking at. There was a man standing in front of Hector's shop. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had done physical labor all his life, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, and a jaw that carried a few days of beard, not the unkempt kind, but the kind that belonged to a man who had been traveling and had more pressing matters than a razor. He wore a coat that had seen weather, and a hat pulled low against the morning glare, and he was looking at the sign above Hector's door with the particular attention of a man who had been looking for exactly this place. Jennie had no reason to look at him twice. She turned back toward Mrs. Henshaw's door and went inside to collect Clara. The man's name was Ezekiel Slater. He was 33 years old. He had ridden into Callow Creek that same morning after 3 weeks on the trail from Colorado, where he had been working as a farrier for a cattle outfit called the Larimer Ranch. He was not a man who stayed in one place for long, not because of any restlessness in his character, exactly, but because circumstances had never arranged themselves in a way that made staying feel like the right choice. He had a farrier's skill and a blacksmith's education, having learned the trade from his father in a shop in Missouri before the war had rearranged everything, and he had been moving generally westward since 1872 with no particular destination in mind, beyond the next place that needed his hands. He went into Hector's shop not to find work, but to ask about a horse with a cracked hoof wall that had been giving him trouble since Wyoming. Hector examined the animal, a big bay gelding named Patch, and gave his assessment. And while the two men talked in the way that men who share a trade always talk, drifting from the immediate problem into the wider conversation of techniques and materials, and the particular demands of Western ground on iron shoes, Ezekiel mentioned that he was looking for work and had papers from the Larimer outfit and 3 previous employers besides. Hector looked at him with interest. "I've been needing an extra hand since March," he said. "My boy Bobby is willing enough, but he's got the skill of a 12-year-old even if he isn't one. You any good with agricultural implements, plows and such?" "Grew up doing it," Ezekiel said. "I might have a job for you starting today if you're interested. Fair pay, board above the livery, meals included." The arrangement was made in the time it takes to shake hands. Ezekiel brought Patch around to the livery and settled his gear and came back to the shop, and Hector put him immediately to work on a backlist of repairs that had piled up over the winter. He was good. Bobby watched him with frank admiration, and Hector watched him with the satisfaction of a man who has solved a problem he did not know how to solve until the solution walked through his door. That evening, as they were banking the forge, Hector mentioned the widow. "Woman came in this morning," he said, in the offhand way of a man sharing information without direction. "Jennie Alden, farm about 2 miles east off the Harlow Road. Lost her husband last fall, fever took him fast. She's got a broken plow, 12 acres that need turning, and about 60 cents to her name if I know anything about anything." Ezekiel was cleaning the work surface with a wire brush. "What's the job?" "Reforge the right share, straighten the left coulter." "Maybe a day's work, probably less if you know what you're about." "What does she owe?" $4. Ezekiel was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who performed generosity in front of an audience, and he had no interest in being noticed for what he was about to do. He simply pulled $4 from his vest pocket and set them on Hector's workbench without ceremony. "Do the work," he said. "Don't mention my name." Hector looked at the money. He looked at Ezekiel. "She'll want to know who paid. Tell her a customer settled the account. That's the truth. She's a proud woman." "Most people worth anything are," Ezekiel said, and he went upstairs to his room above the livery. Hector was true to his word, and when Jennie came back the next morning with Clara at her side and her 62 cents counted out in her palm, he told her the bill had been settled by a customer who wished to remain anonymous, and that her plow would be ready by 3 o'clock. Jennie stood in the doorway of the shop and looked at him with the particular expression of a person who has been simultaneously relieved and unsettled, and the relief and the unsettlement were so evenly matched that neither one quite won. "Who?" she asked. "Anonymous," Hector said with the firmness of a man who has made a promise. "That's not a name, Hector." "No, it is not." She stood there another moment. Clara was pulling at the hem of her skirt, interested in a cat that had appeared from somewhere in the depths of the shop, and Jennie let herself be pulled. She was not the kind of woman who forgot a debt. She was exactly the kind of woman for whom an anonymous kindness was more troubling than a known one, because a known debt could be repaid and an unknown one could not. She took her plow at 3 o'clock. It was better than she had hoped. The share was reforged clean and the coulter ran true, and when she got it home and tested the assembly in the near paddock, it pulled straight and smooth, and she stood there in the April afternoon with her hands on the handles and something in her chest that was almost but not quite peace. She asked about the bill 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. She asked Hector, and he would not say. She asked Bobby, and he shrugged with genuine ignorance. She asked Mabel Stroud at the general store, who knew everything that happened in Callow Creek before it finished happening, and Mabel had heard there was a new man working at the smithy, a fellow from out of town, but she did not know his name, and she could not say for certain that he was the one. In the meantime, Jennie turned her 12 acres. She did it herself, rising before dawn and working until the light failed, with Clara sometimes walking alongside her in the field, picking up stones and carrying them to the edge in a tin bucket. The planting went in on schedule: corn mostly, some sorghum, a kitchen garden of beans and squash and tomatoes behind the house. The soil was good. Thomas had known how to choose land. That was one of the things she had loved about him, his sure instinct for good ground, and the farm he had bought with borrowed money in 1874 was genuinely promising in a way that made his death in 1877 feel not just personal but economically cruel. She did not dwell on Thomas with bitterness. She had loved him and she had mourned him thoroughly, and she was now in the process of converting that love into something useful, which was the determination to keep what he had built and make it grow. She was not interested in remarrying, or at least she had not been until recently, and even now the thought arrived sideways, not as a desire but as a practical acknowledgement that a farm this size really did need 2 sets of hands. She filed the anonymous payment away in the back of her mind and let herself be distracted by the work, and it was 3 weeks after the plow repair, in early May, that she first encountered Ezekiel Slater properly. She had come into town for seed. She had underestimated the sorghum, and she stopped at the smithy because the buckboard had developed a squeak in the left rear wheel that was working her nerves. She drove up to the front of the shop and tied the horse and went inside, and the man she found there was not Hector but someone she had not seen before, bent over an anvil with a hammer, working a piece of iron with the absorbed concentration of a man who genuinely loves what he does. He looked up when she came in. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that she registered without meaning to, the way you register the color of a sky that is thinking about changing. "Hector's at the farrier," the man said. "He'll be back in an hour. I'm Ezekiel Slater. I work here." "Jennie Alden," she said. "I've got a squeak in my rear wheel. Could be the hub, could be the axle pin." I couldn't say for certain. "Let me take a look," he said, and he set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his leather apron and followed her out into the street, and he crouched beside the wheel with the same focused attention he had been giving the iron, and she stood beside him and watched him work. "Axle pin," he said after a moment, touching the mechanism with 2 fingers. "Loose in the fitting, easy fix." He looked up at her from his crouch, shielding his eyes against the sun. 5 minutes. "How much?" She asked. "Nothing, it's a 5-minute job. I pay for work," she said. Something in his expression shifted slightly, not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it, a recognition of something. "Quarter then," he said. She paid him the quarter, and he fixed the wheel, and she went and got her sorghum seed from the general store and came back and loaded it into the now quiet buckboard. And when she climbed up onto the seat, she looked back at the smithy, and through the open front of the shop she could see Ezekiel Slater back at his anvil, the hammer rising and falling with that same focused rhythm. She drove home thinking about nothing in particular, which was unusual for her, and it was only when she was unhitching the horse in the barn that she realized she had been thinking about gray-green eyes for the last 2 miles without knowing it. The second encounter was not accidental. 3 days later, Clara came down with a fever. Not the terrible, raging kind that had taken Thomas, but the ordinary, grinding kind that children got in spring. And Jennie spent 2 nights sitting beside her daughter's bed with cold cloths and worry, and a lamp burning low. When the fever broke on the 3rd day and Clara sat up demanding biscuits, Jennie walked to town to get willow bark from Mabel Stroud's medicine shelf and a few other things she had run low on during the siege. She was coming out of the general store when she heard her name and turned to find Ezekiel Slater standing on the boardwalk with a wrapped parcel under his arm, clearly heading somewhere. "Mrs. Alden," he said. He had a slight formality in his address that she found she did not mind, the way some men used a woman's name as though it were something worth treating carefully. "Mr. Slater," she said. She paused because something had been sitting in her since the first time she met him, something she was not yet ready to name but which had enough weight to it that it arranged itself into words before she had quite decided to speak them. "Were you the one who paid for my plow repair?" He looked at her steadily for a moment. He was not a man who flinched. "What makes you ask?" he said. "Because Hector won't say who it was and you're new in town and the timing is what it is," she said. "And because I have been asking that question since April and I would like an answer." Another moment's pause. "Yes," he said simply. She had prepared herself for several possible responses to this confirmation, including gratitude and a brisk repayment plan, but what she actually felt was something more complicated, a warmth that began somewhere in the chest and moved upward, inconvenient and uninvited. "Why?" she asked. He seemed to consider this seriously, as though the question deserved more than a quick answer. "Hector mentioned the situation," he said. "You had a farm to plant and a tool that was broken and a bill you couldn't pay. It seemed like the simplest way to fix a practical problem." "It was $4, she said. "That's not a small sum." "No," he agreed, "but you needed it more than I needed to keep it." She looked at him, he looked at her. The May morning moved around them, the dust of the street lifting in the warm wind, a dog crossing somewhere behind her. "I intend to pay it back," she said. "That isn't necessary. To me it is." He seemed to understand that. He did not argue. "When you're able," he said. "There's no hurry." She went home and told Clara about it because Clara was 7 and old enough to understand some things, and her daughter listened with the serious attention that children give to stories about adults behaving in ways they can't quite categorize. "Is he nice?" Clara asked. "I don't know yet," Jennie said honestly, but she found out. Over the next 2 months, which were the months of early summer, of long days and hard work and the slow emergence of the corn from the dark soil, Jennie and Ezekiel Slater began to know each other in the way that people in small towns know each other when they are paying attention, through brief encounters at the store, through the particular information that travels along the invisible wire of a community where everyone's business is everyone else's business, through the careful, circling conversation of two people who are each trying to take the measure of the other without making it obvious. He was at the smithy 6 days a week. She came to town once or twice a week for various necessities, and she always stopped at the smithy at least briefly, sometimes with a repair, sometimes without any stated reason at all, and after the first few times they were both clear-eyed enough about the pattern to know what it meant, even if neither of them said so. She learned things about him in pieces. He had grown up in Missouri, in a town called Boonville. His father had been a blacksmith. He had 2 brothers, one older and one younger. The older one had died at Shiloh in 1862, and the younger was farming somewhere in Nebraska. He had not married, not because of any want of feeling, she gathered, but because his life had not organized itself around stability long enough for the right circumstances to arise. He had a dry humor that emerged without warning from behind his generally serious manner, and she found that she was always slightly surprised by it, and then unsurprised, the way you are when you find something that is exactly what it appeared to be. He learned about her in a different way, because Jennie Alden was a woman who spoke directly when she chose to speak and went quiet when she did not, and the line between those two states was clear and deliberate. He learned that she had come west from Ohio with Thomas in 1874, that she had built the farmhouse kitchen herself with Thomas's cousin in the fall of 1875, that she had lost a son in infancy before Clara, and that she carried that loss the way people carry the losses that have been survived rather than resolved, with a steadiness that does not pretend to be peace, but is something equally durable. He learned that she was funny, in the dry, unexpected way of a woman who has decided that laughing at the right things is a form of dignity. He learned that she had strong opinions about the proper management of a kitchen garden, and that she would share them with you whether you had asked or not. He learned that when she was working something out in her mind, she got very quiet and still, and that the stillness was not absence but the opposite of absence. In July, there was a town social at the Methodist Church. These events were a fixture of Western life, part utility and part ritual, combining the community's need for entertainment with the church's need for funds, and they involved food and music and the particular social diplomacy of a small community in which everybody knew everybody else's business. Jennie went every year because it would have been noticed if she had not, and because Clara loved the dancing and the cake. Ezekiel had not planned to go. He was not naturally a social man and town gatherings were not his preference. But Bobby mentioned it and Hector mentioned it, and somehow he found himself there on a warm July evening, standing on the edge of the churchyard with a glass of lemonade, watching the fiddle player tune up. He saw Jennie across the yard. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, a blue that picked up something in her dark hair, and she had left her hair partially down in a way that was different from how she wore it in the street, and she was talking to a woman named Grace Dunmore while Clara orbited them both, the way children orbit their mothers at social events, never quite leaving but never quite staying still. He crossed the yard. He did not hurry. "Mrs. Alden," he said. "Mr. Slater," she said. Her eyes were doing something, a kind of brightness, that she did not try to suppress but also did not announce. "I didn't think you attended these." "I don't usually," he said. "Hello, Miss Clara." Clara, who was not shy, looked at him with frank appraisal. "Mama says you fixed our plow," she said. "Clara," Jennie said, but without real heat. "I did," Ezekiel said to Clara. "Do you like the plow?" Clara considered this. "I like the corn better," she said, "because you can eat corn." "That is a very sensible view," Ezekiel said gravely. Grace Dunmore had removed herself with the tactful efficiency of a woman who reads situations accurately, and Jennie and Ezekiel stood together in the summer evening, while the fiddle started up and the yard filled with movement. "Would you dance?" he asked, and then, because he was not a man who surrounded straightforward things with unnecessary qualification, "If you want to, not because you should." She looked at him. The music was a real, quick and cheerful, and around them people were pairing up and forming sets. "I would like to," she said, and she meant it in a way that was not entirely about dancing. They danced 2 reels and a slower piece that came later in the evening, and during the slower piece, with her hand in his and his other hand at her waist, she was very aware of the warmth of him and the particular care with which he held her, firmly but without presumption, as though she were something he wanted to treat well rather than something he wanted to keep. Clara fell asleep against the church wall between 2 older women who tended her, with the natural maternal competence of women who have raised children, and know what a sleeping child needs without being asked. Jennie checked on her twice and found her fine both times, and came back to where Ezekiel was standing with Hector and a few other men, and he separated from the group when he saw her coming in that quiet way of his that was not theatrical and not cold but simply attentive. "She's sleeping," Jennie said. "Long day for a 7-year-old, he said. "Long day for most of us." They stood together on the edge of the yard. The music had slowed, and some of the families with young children were beginning to leave. The stars above Kansas in summer are a specific kind of extravagant, as though the sky has decided to make up in spectacle what the flat land lacks in drama, and Jennie was looking up at them when she said, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for the plow and for being honest when I asked." "You deserved an honest answer," he said, "and you needed the plow. Most people would have let me wonder indefinitely." "I'm not most people," he said, without arrogance, just as a statement of fact. She looked at him then, fully and without the sideways caution that she had been maintaining for weeks, and he looked back at her, and the thing that had been accumulating between them since May settled into something that both of them recognized. "Come for supper on Sunday," she said. "It's the least I can offer in the direction of repaying you." "I told you that wasn't necessary," he said. "I told you that to me it is," she said. "Sunday, 6 o'clock." He came on Sunday at 6 o'clock with his hat in his hand, and a small bunch of wildflowers that Clara received with such undisguised pleasure that Jennie suspected her daughter's opinion of Ezekiel Slater had already been decided before the evening began. The supper was simple roasted chicken, early corn from the garden, biscuits, preserved peach pie, and they sat at the kitchen table in the long summer evening with the door open and the warm air moving through, and they talked in the way that people talk when they have been circling each other for months and have finally agreed to stop circling. He told her about the Larimer Ranch, about Colorado, about the high country in spring when the snowmelt came down, and everything turned green in the span of about 10 days. She told him about Ohio, about the autumn canning seasons of her childhood, about her mother who had died when Jennie was 16, and whose particular way of braiding bread she had never been able to replicate no matter how many times she tried. After supper, Clara fell asleep in her chair with the naturalness of a child who trusts the people around her completely, and Jennie carried her to bed and came back to find Ezekiel washing the dishes in the basin with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who is not making a performance of helping but who simply sees what needs doing. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, and handed her a dish to dry. They washed and dried together in silence for a few minutes, the lamp throwing warm light across the kitchen, the evening insects beginning their chorus outside, and it was so ordinary and so exactly right that Jennie felt something in her chest loosen in a way she had not been expecting, as though some structural tension she had forgotten there had finally been released. He left at 9, because it was a long enough walk back to the livery that he needed to go while there was still some light in the western sky, and at the door he turned his hat in his hands and said, "Thank you for supper, Mrs. Alden." "Jennie," she said, "a beat." "Jennie," he said, and the way he said it, quietly and carefully, as though taking something seriously that deserved to be taken seriously, made her grip the door frame without being aware that she was doing it. "Come again," she said, "if you want to." "I want to," he said. August came in its usual Kansas way, blazing and relentless, the heat sitting over the plains in a white haze that turned the horizon liquid and made the afternoons feel like something to be endured rather than lived through. The corn grew in spite of it, or perhaps because of it, the tall stalks filling in and tasseling, and Jennie walked the rows each evening and did the mathematics of yield and price that never quite came out as favorably as she needed. Ezekiel came for supper every Sunday. Sometimes he came on Saturday afternoons too, and helped with things that needed a second pair of hands, a fence post that had leaned so far it needed to be reset, a section of barn roof that had developed a soft spot, the repair of a window shutter that had been banging in the night wind. He never arrived and announced what he had come to do. He arrived and looked around and found what needed doing and did it, and Jennie, who was not a woman who accepted help easily, found that she had accepted his before she had quite decided to. Clara had decided about him with the absolute authority of a child who does not yet know how to be strategic about her affections. By mid-August she was saving things to tell him: a hawk she had seen over the north field, a frog she had found in the kitchen garden, the particular way the thunderclouds had looked from her bedroom window during the storm that came through on a Wednesday and left the air tasting like iron. She told him these things the moment he arrived, with the breathless urgency of a child delivering important news, and he listened to all of it with the same gravity he brought to everything, asking follow-up questions, taking the information seriously. Jennie watched this and felt something she did not have a clean word for, something that was partly gratitude and partly tenderness, and partly a kind of recognition, as though the man she had been cautiously observing for months had finally revealed something conclusive about himself. One Saturday afternoon in late August, while he was repairing the fence and she was weeding the kitchen garden nearby, he said, without looking up from the post, "I've been thinking about staying." She did not pretend to misunderstand. She sat back on her heels and looked at the beans for a moment. "In Callow Creek," she said. "In general," he said. "I've been moving since I was 23. I'm not sure what I was moving toward, but I think I might have arrived." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a large thing to say," she said. "I know it is. And you're saying it while you're fixing my fence." He looked at her then over the fence post with those gray-green eyes and that almost humor. "Is that a problem?" She stood up and brushed the earth from her hands and looked at him. "No," she said. "I just want to be clear that I'm not easy to be with. I'm stubborn and I have opinions and I have a 7-year-old daughter and a farm that is deeply in debt and I'm not looking for someone to rescue me." "I know," he said. "I'm not looking to rescue anyone." "Then what are you looking for?" she asked. He considered this carefully, the way he considered everything. "Something worth staying for," he said. The sun was beating down on the August prairie and the corn was moving in the hot wind, and somewhere in the house, Clara was singing a song she had learned from Mrs. Henshaw's primer, off-key and cheerful, and Jennie Alden looked at Ezekiel Slater across her fence post and thought that possibly she was done being cautious. "Come to supper," she said. "Stay and talk afterward. We'll see where it goes." "That's all I'm asking," he said. September in Kansas belongs to harvest, the great annual reckoning between effort and outcome, and the Alden Farms corn came in better than Jennie had dared to hope. Not a spectacular yield, but a solid one, enough to pay down a significant portion of Thomas's debt and put something aside for the winter and the spring planting. She hired 2 boys from neighboring farms for the harvest and drove the load into Callow Creek herself, and she paid Mabel Stroud against the account, and when she got to the amount she had mentally designated as the repayment of Ezekiel's $4, she paid that against the account too, and then she drove to the smithy and told him she had done it. "I paid it into your wages at the smithy," she said. "You can collect it from Hector." He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts amusement and exasperation. "Jennie, I told you I would pay it back," she said. "You made me a dozen suppers." "That was something else," she said firmly. "The $4 was a debt and now it is paid and I feel considerably better about everything." He shook his head slowly, but he was smiling the full, open smile that she saw rarely enough that it felt like something each time, like sunlight coming out from behind a bank of cloud. "All right," he said. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said. "Now we're even." "On that particular account," he said. She looked at him and the unspoken thing between them was large and warm and present, and she said, "Come Sunday. Bring nothing. You're just coming to supper." "Is that different from other Sundays?" "Not in any way I can explain right now," she said, and drove the buckboard home. That Sunday was the last of September, with the first real bite of autumn in the air, and the trees along the creek beginning to tip into gold and rust. Ezekiel arrived at 6 with nothing in his hands, which for him required a conscious effort, and Clara ran from the house to meet him at the gate, which she had taken to doing sometime in August without anyone having suggested it. After supper and after Clara was in bed, they sat on the porch with cups of coffee and the good, dense quiet of the Kansas evening, and he said, "I've been talking to Hector about a partnership." She turned to look at him. "What kind of partnership?" "Buying in. He wants to retire in the next year or 2 and he needs someone to take the shop over. He'd sell to me at a fair price over time if I wanted it." "Do you want it?" she asked. "I think so," he said. "It would mean putting down roots." "Roots are generally considered a good thing," she said. "Depends on where you're putting them," he said, and he looked at her with the directness that was characteristic of him, the way he looked at a thing he was taking seriously. She set down her coffee cup. The autumn stars were coming out above the dark line of the prairie, big and cold and beautiful. "Ezekiel," she said. "Jennie," he said. "If you are saying what I think you're saying," she said carefully, "then I want you to say it directly, because I am a woman who needs things to be clear, and I have a daughter who is attached to you, and if this is going somewhere, then I need to know that we are both walking in the same direction." He turned in his chair to face her fully. "I'm in love with you," he said. "I've been in love with you since about June, when I realized that you were going to argue with me about the quarter for the wheel job, and I thought to myself that I had never wanted to be argued with more in my life. And I would like, with your permission, to court you properly, which in my understanding means asking your intention and stating mine, and proceeding accordingly." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark of the porch. Her heart was doing something she had not felt in a long time, that particular unguarded acceleration that belongs to moments when something important is being decided, and the deciding is going in the right direction. "My intention is to keep this farm and raise my daughter well and live a life that means something," she said. "And I think possibly my intention also includes you, if you mean what you say and say what you mean." "I always say what I mean," he said. "You've known me long enough to have established that." "I have," she said. And then, because she was Jennie Alden and Jennie Alden did not circle around things when she had made up her mind, "I'm in love with you too. I've been fighting it since July, and I'm tired of fighting it." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, carefully and deliberately, the way he did everything, and she let him. And they sat like that in the October approaching night with the stars overhead and the whole immense, open prairie around them. And it was one of those moments that does not announce itself as important while it is happening, but which you know, even while living it, that you will carry for the rest of your life. He did not stay late. He walked home through the dark town, and he thought about what had been said, and he did not qualify it or reinterpret it or pull it apart the way some men do when the thing they have wanted comes true, and they suddenly need to test whether they really wanted it. He had meant what he said, and she had meant what she said, and the next thing was simply the continuation of it. October was the month of their courtship in its formalized sense, and the town of Callow Creek, which missed nothing, had opinions. Mrs. Dunmore thought it was a fine thing. A widow needed a reliable man, and there was something very solid about the new fellow at the smithy. Old Pete Brannigan at the saloon thought it was a little fast, less than a year since the husband had died, but he also acknowledged that when a woman had 12 acres to manage alone, fast became a relative concept. Mabel Stroud at the general store thought they were well matched, and since Mabel's opinion was the most reliable in the county, this was generally taken as the last word on the subject. Hector Prout, who had set the whole thing in motion by mentioning the widow to the stranger, said nothing at all and smiled into his coffee cup with the private satisfaction of a man who has done a good turn and does not need anyone to know it. Clara had no opinion except that she liked Ezekiel very much and thought it was a good idea that he come for supper every day instead of just on Sundays and Saturdays. She had told him this directly, with her usual lack of social navigation, and he had told her very seriously that he would do his best. There were complications, because there always are. Thomas Alden's older brother, a man named Frank Alden, arrived from Ohio in mid-October with the stated intention of seeing how his brother's widow and child were getting on, and the unstated intention, which became apparent within 24 hours, of suggesting that Jennie sell the farm and bring Clara back to Ohio, where the family could look after them both. Frank was not a malicious man. He was the kind of well-meaning man who has decided that his well-meaning is sufficient justification for nearly any proposal, and he sat at Jennie's kitchen table with his hat on the chair beside him, and told her that she was a young woman and Thomas would not want her to struggle alone. "I'm not struggling alone," Jennie said with absolute calm. "I brought in a good harvest. I've paid down most of the debt. The farm is mine and it will continue to be mine." "A woman running a farm by herself," Frank said, with the particular headshake of a man whose opinion is fully formed before the conversation begins. "I am not entirely by myself," Jennie said. "Frank stayed 5 days. He met Ezekiel on the 3rd day, at supper, which Jennie invited him to without any particular strategy, but which turned out to be strategic anyway. Because what Frank observed across the kitchen table was a man who spoke to his sister-in-law with respect, and listened when she talked and looked at Clara with genuine warmth, and a woman who was not performing happiness but was simply and unmistakably present in a way that Frank had not seen since before Thomas got sick. He left on the 5th day and shook Ezekiel's hand in the front yard and said, "Take care of her." "She takes care of herself," Ezekiel said. "But yes." Frank looked at him. "You'll do," he said. November came in cold and decisive, the way Kansas Novembers do, the plains going gray and the sky coming down low, and the farm settled into its winter rhythms. The animals to tend, the preserves to inventory, the root cellar to keep up, the long dark evenings that were either lonely or companionable depending entirely on who you spent them with. On a cold Saturday in mid-November, Ezekiel drove his horse out to the farm in the early afternoon and found Jennie in the barn with a problem. One of her 2 workhorses, a gray gelding named Chester, had developed a severe case of thrush in his front hooves from standing in damp ground during the wet October, and the smell of it and the horse's distress were serious enough that Jennie had been up half the previous night with him. Ezekiel looked at the hooves with a professional eye, and then went back to town, and came back within an hour with the things he needed: copper sulfate solution, clean packing material, the right tools, and he treated both hooves with the efficiency and care of a man who has done this before and knows that doing it right the first time is the only worthwhile approach. "He'll be fine," he said, washing his hands at the pump. "Keep the stall dry. I'll come back in 3 days to check." Jennie was watching him from the barn door with her arms crossed over her chest and her expression doing that thing it did sometimes, that open, unguarded look that she gave him only when she had forgotten to put her guard back up after a moment of relief. "I don't know what I would do without you," she said, and she said it simply, without performance, which was the only way she said things. He dried his hands and walked toward her and stopped close enough that the air between them was warm despite the cold day. "You'd figure it out," he said. "You always do. But I'm glad I'm here." "So am I," she said. He kissed her for the first time right there in the barn doorway with the cold wind at their backs and Chester regarding them over his stall door with the philosophical patience of a horse recovering from an inconvenient illness. It was a careful kiss, not a tentative one. There is a difference, the kind that comes from certainty rather than from testing, and Jennie kissed him back with the same deliberateness, one hand coming up to the lapel of his coat as though steadying herself, and when it ended they stood very still for a moment in the winter barn doorway. "I meant what I said in September," he said quietly. "All of it." "So did I," she said. He asked her to marry him at Christmas time. He asked her in the kitchen of her farmhouse on Christmas Eve, with Clara sitting nearby painting a picture of something that was either a horse or a large dog, and he asked without a ring. He would get a ring later, he said, when she told him she would take it, but with everything in his voice that such a question deserves to carry. Jennie put down the dish she was drying and looked at him and said, "Yes, of course, yes." Clara, who had been listening with the impressive covertness of a child who has learned exactly how much stillness is required to become invisible to adults, put down her brush and said, "Does this mean you're coming to live here?" "If your mother will have me," Ezekiel said. Clara considered. "You can sleep in the room at the end," she said. "The one with the good window, but you can't move my things." "I wouldn't dream of it," he said. They were married on the 14th of February, 1879. Which was a Saturday, in the Callow Creek Methodist Church with Hector Prout standing up with Ezekiel and Grace Dunmore standing up with Jennie, and Clara in a white dress that Jennie had made by hand from fabric she had been hoarding since October, her dark hair in a braid with a ribbon woven through it. The church was warm and full of the compressed energy of a community that likes a wedding, and had been expecting this one for long enough that the expectation itself had become a kind of excitement. Ezekiel stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which he had bought new for the occasion from the dry goods store in Dodge City, where he had gone on a supply run and which fit him well, and he watched Jennie walk down the aisle on her own, because she had said she was not walking with anyone, she would walk herself. And the thing that happened on his face when he saw her was something that Grace Dunmore would describe to her husband that evening as the look of a man who cannot believe his luck and is not trying to hide it. Jennie wore her mother's brooch at her collar. Her hair was up with small white flowers pinned through it. She had made her own dress, a deep ivory with buttons down the back that Clara had fastened with intense concentration and some difficulty that morning, and she walked down the aisle looking at Ezekiel with the clear-eyed directness that was simply how she looked at everything, not as a performance of confidence but as a statement of presence. And when she reached him, she took his hands and they were both steady. The vows were the traditional ones, and when the minister reached the part about richer and poorer, in sickness and in health, Jennie felt Clara take her hand from the pew beside her, and she squeezed it without looking away from Ezekiel. And he saw it happen, and the thing in his face deepened into something even more whole. The celebration afterward was in the churchyard, the February air cold and bright with a thin sun that turned everything silver, and there was food enough for twice the number of people present and music, and the particular joyful disorder of a community event, when everyone has brought their best dish and their best behavior, and is genuinely glad to be there. Ezekiel danced with Jennie and then danced with Clara, who stood on his feet and steered them both around the yard with an authority that made several of the watching adults laugh. Hector made a toast that was brief and genuine, and involved the word stubborn applied to both of them as a compliment. Mabel Stroud cried a little, which surprised no one. They drove home in the late afternoon, the three of them on the buckboard with Clara between them and the cold air turning pink along the western horizon, and Clara fell asleep against Ezekiel's arm before they reached the farm, and he drove one-handed with Jennie's head resting on his shoulder, and neither of them said anything for the last mile because nothing needed saying. Ezekiel moved into the farmhouse and into the room with the good window, as specified, and the farm that had been holding itself together with the careful force of one woman's began to breathe differently, the way a thing does when it is being given what it actually needs rather than only what it can survive on. He bought Hector's share in the smithy by the following spring, a partnership arrangement with a purchase over 4 years, and he ran the shop with the same focused competence he brought to everything. And Callow Creek's metalworking needs were met with a thoroughness that had not been available since before Hector's eyesight started going. Bobby the apprentice improved considerably under Ezekiel's teaching, and within a year could do most basic work without supervision. The farm's second season, their first season together, was a good one. 2 horses instead of 1 managing the heavy work made a meaningful difference, and Ezekiel had suggestions about the rotation and the soil preparation that came from having worked with agricultural land in several different states, and Jennie had suggestions about the timing and the varieties that came from 5 years of learning exactly what this particular land wanted, and the combination of these 2 sets of knowledge produced results that neither of them could have managed independently. The debt that Thomas had left was retired in full by the fall of 1879. Jennie paid the last of it on an October afternoon and came home and told Ezekiel at supper, and he looked at her across the table and said, "You did that." "We did that," she said. "You did the hard part," he said. "The 2 years when it was just you and Clara." She thought about that. "The hard part was the first winter," she said. "After that it was just work." Clara was 8 by then, and growing with a speed that alarmed Jennie and delighted Ezekiel, who observed her development with the interested attention of a man who had not expected to have a child in his life and finds, upon having one, that it is one of the more astonishing things that can happen to a person. She was reading well and beginning arithmetic, and had a particular gift for drawing that Jennie recognized as coming from Thomas, who had sketched constantly on any available surface, and she encouraged it with the same seriousness that she brought to everything she thought mattered. He adopted Clara formally in the spring of 1880, which was not a complicated legal process, but was a significant one, done in the courthouse in Dodge City with a judge who had seen enough of the West to be unsurprised by unconventional family arrangements, and who signed the papers with a briskness that did not diminish the weight of what they meant. Clara, who had been involved in the decision with complete transparency from the beginning, said afterward that she thought she might like to be a lawyer when she grew up because judges seemed to have a lot of power and she thought she could use it well. Ezekiel looked at Jennie. Jennie looked at Ezekiel. Absolutely possible, Jennie told her daughter. The spring of 1880 brought news that was both ordinary and miraculous, as such news always is. Jennie was pregnant. She knew it before she told Ezekiel, knew it with the particular body knowledge of a woman who has been pregnant before, the specific heaviness in the lower back and the change in how food smelled. And she turned it over in her mind for a week before she told him, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted to arrive at the moment of telling already knowing how she felt about it. She told him on a Sunday morning in April, in the kitchen while he was making coffee, which was something he had taken over because he made it better than she did, and they had both accepted this without fanfare. She came up behind him and put her arms around him from behind and said against his shoulder, "We're going to need that second bedroom properly furnished by September." He was still for a moment. Then he turned around and took her face in both his hands and looked at her. He did not say anything immediately. His eyes were doing the thing they did when he was feeling something too large for his usual economy of expression, a kind of overflow. "September," he said. "Roughly," she said. He kissed her forehead and her temple and then held her against his chest with the careful strength that she had come to know as his particular way of expressing things that were beyond words, and she stood in the warm kitchen in the April morning and let herself be held. Clara received the news with characteristic pragmatism. "Am I going to have to share the big window?" she asked. "No," Jennie said. "The baby gets the middle room," Clara considered. "What if it's a boy?" "Then it's a boy," Jennie said. "Why? Because I've heard boys are loud," Clara said. "I want you to be prepared for that." "I'll take it under advisement," Jennie said. The pregnancy was healthy. Jennie worked through most of it with the same steady output she brought to everything, scaling back only in the last 2 months when the late summer heat combined with the increasing weight made the field work genuinely impractical. And Ezekiel took over the daily farm work with the help of a hired boy named Sam who was 16 and strong and willing, while maintaining the smithy with Bobby's help. The baby came in the first week of September, 1880, on a Tuesday morning with Mrs. Henshaw in attendance as midwife. Ezekiel waited in the kitchen with the contained agitation of a man who is accustomed to being useful and is in a situation where he cannot be, who has been told to make coffee and has made it, and has been told to stay out of the bedroom, and is staying out of the bedroom, and is finding both instructions extremely difficult. Clara sat beside him at the kitchen table drawing horses, with the focused calm of a child who has decided that her job is to be composed on behalf of the adults. When Mrs. Henshaw called him in, the room was quiet in the particular way rooms become quiet after the noise and intensity of birth, and Jennie was in the bed with a child wrapped in linen and her hair loose around her face, and a look in her eyes that was exhaustion and wonder and something more private. "A boy," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the bundle in his arms, and he held his son for the first time and looked down at the small, complete face of him and said nothing at all for a full minute. "Thomas Ezekiel Slater," Jennie said. She watched him look at the baby. "I want to give him Thomas's name if you'll allow it. It seems right." He looked up at her. "It's more than right," he said. "Thank you." Clara appeared in the doorway, having waited with heroic patience. "Can I see?" she asked. "Come here," Jennie said. Clara climbed carefully onto the other side of the bed and peered at her brother with the critical attention of someone conducting an assessment. "He's small," she said. "He'll grow," Ezekiel said. "He looks like you a little," Clara said to Ezekiel, which was probably not accurate given the baby was 3 hours old, but which clearly made Ezekiel very happy. The following years in Callow Creek moved with the particular rhythm of a life that has found its proper shape. The farm grew into its potential. 2 strong harvests in 1881 and 1882, clearing the remaining financial hesitance and allowing Jennie to put genuine savings aside for the first time. The smithy prospered as the town grew, and Ezekiel's reputation as a reliable and skilled craftsman brought work from farms and ranches for 20 miles around. Bobby became genuinely accomplished and eventually, at 20 years old, began talking about a shop of his own somewhere up near Hayes, which Ezekiel supported with both advice and a modest loan. Thomas, called Tom by everyone, proved to be healthy and vigorous and exactly as loud as Clara had predicted, and he took to the farm with an instinctive enthusiasm, following Ezekiel around from the time he could walk, holding tools with a focus that made his father smile and his sister shake her head with the particular long-suffering of an older sibling watching a younger one be obviously adored. There were hard stretches, because there always are. A late frost in 1881 killed Jennie's early kitchen garden, and she had to replant in May. And she did it without complaint, and the second planting came in fine. A dry spell in the summer of 1882 cut the corn yield by a third, and they were careful that winter with the money, eating what they had preserved and not spending what they hadn't saved. And it was hard, but it was manageable in the way that things are manageable when 2 people face them together, and neither one is inclined to dramatize the difficulty. In the spring of 1883, Clara turned 12 and was working through a series of books that Jennie ordered from a publisher in Chicago, books on history and natural science and mathematics that were more advanced than anything available at the one-room school in Callow Creek. And she was reading them with a speed and depth that made both her parents aware that the ordinary educational arrangements of a small Kansas town were not going to be adequate for much longer. It was Ezekiel who found the solution. A friend from his Colorado days wrote to say he had moved to Lawrence, Kansas, where the university had been operating since 1866, and that there was a good school for younger students there as well, a proper secondary school with teachers trained in academic subjects. He brought the letter to Jennie, and they sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and talked about it with the careful honesty that they brought to everything important. "It's years away yet," Jennie said. "She's 12. "I know," he said, "but it's worth knowing it exists, worth saving for." "Clara will want to go," Jennie said, "if she knows about it. Then we tell her and we start saving," he said. "She's got 5 years, and she'll earn her way in on the strength of her mind, but we need to have the means." Jennie looked at him across the table. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since last fall," he admitted, "when I watched her do the division problems in her head." Jennie reached across the table and put her hand over his. "She is remarkable," she said. "She takes after her mother," he said. "Flattery," she said. "Fact," he said. That summer, 1883, Jennie stood at the kitchen garden fence one evening in July and watched the farm that had nearly broken her 5 years ago standing whole and green and generous in the late light, the corn tall in the north field, the beans climbing their poles, the house solid and well tended with its new fence that Ezekiel had built in the spring, and Clara somewhere on the other side of the barn reading with her back against the fence post, and Tom waddling after a chicken with the inexhaustible optimism of a 2-year-old who has never yet caught a chicken, but sees no reason this time should be different. She felt the warmth of Ezekiel's presence before she heard him come up behind her, the particular quality of the air that changed when he was near, and he came to stand beside her at the fence. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about a morning 5 years ago when I walked to Hector's shop with 62 cents and a broken plow," she said, and how I thought I was going to lose all of this. He was quiet beside her, a warm, present quiet. And now, he said. She turned to look at him, at the face she had come to know with the thoroughness of years and proximity, the gray-green eyes and the jaw and the particular way he held himself, a kind of contained solidity that she had grown to love with the same sureness that she loved the farm and the open sky. Now I think about all the threads that had to line up, she said. You had to ride in from Colorado. Hector had to mention me. You had to decide to do something about it. I had to be stubborn enough to find out who had paid. You were extremely stubborn about that, he said. I have been told, she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood like that at the garden fence in the July evening while Tom finally caught the chicken, and the chicken expressed its strong objection to this, and Tom fell down in surprise and sat in the dirt looking astonished before deciding to laugh about it. Thank you, Jennie said. For what? For the $4, she said. For fixing the plow, for being honest when I asked, for all of it. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Thank you for walking and looking for the man who paid, he said, and for not letting it go. I told you, she said, I never let a debt go unpaid. Is it paid, he asked. She thought about the farm and the children and the particular weight and warmth of his arm around her shoulders, and the life that had been built in the years since that April morning when she had walked into Hector's shop with 62 cents and no good options. Not even close, she said. I expect it will take the rest of my life to settle it properly. That, Ezekiel said, is entirely fine with me. Tom pulled himself up from the dirt and went after the chicken again. Clara appeared around the side of the barn with her book under her arm and assessed her brother's chicken-related project with the detached interest of a scholar observing a natural phenomenon. The corn moved in the warm evening wind. The stars were beginning to come out above the enormous Kansas sky, one at a time and then all at once. Jennie Alden, who was now Jennie Slater, who had kept her farm and paid her debts and raised her daughter and buried her first husband, and loved her second one in the full and deliberate way of a woman who has earned the right to love without apology, stood in the July evening of 1883 on the ground that was hers, and felt the particular completeness of a life that has been lived honestly. There were things she did not know yet. She did not know that in 2 years there would be a daughter, a red-headed, loud, opinionated girl whom they would name Frances after Ezekiel's mother, and who would trail after Clara with the same devotion that Tom now gave to Ezekiel. She did not know that Clara would in fact go to Lawrence at 17 and would study, and then teach and eventually, in a twist that a 12-year-old's prophecy had dimly suggested, study law in a time when women doing such things required both courage and resources and a family that believed it was possible. She did not know that Tom would grow up to love the farm with a wholeness that would make succession feel like continuity rather than change, or that Ezekiel would teach him the blacksmith's trade alongside the farming and he would carry both, the way his father had. She did not know that Hector Prout, in his retirement, would tell the story of the stranger who had paid the widow's bill to anyone who would listen, and that the story would travel through Callow Creek and become one of those small local legends that towns keep, a story about a simple good act and what it set in motion. She did not know any of it. She only knew the evening and the farm and the man beside her and the children in the yard, and the extraordinary, ordinary fact of a life that had found its proper shape. Ezekiel looked down at her. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About." She turned her face up to look at him, the woman who had walked 2 miles with 62 cents and the determination not to cry and the absolute intention to hold onto what she had built, and she smiled at him with the full, open warmth of a woman who has nothing left to guard against. "About how strange it is," she said, "that a broken plow can change everything." He looked at her for a long moment with those steady gray-green eyes, and then he kissed her in the July evening, while Tom crowed in triumph somewhere behind them, the chicken apparently having been definitively caught or definitively surrendered, and Clara's voice, rose in the warm air, calling that supper was going to be late if nobody came inside. And the stars kept coming out one at a time above the wide Kansas sky, uncountable and steady. The same stars that had been there long before any of them and would be there long after, bearing witness to the small and consequential decisions that make a life. The farm breathed around them, green and patient and good. They went inside together,